You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith Radio. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney, and joining me as always is my trusty co-host, Ben Triplett. Ben.
Word.
I hear that your wife is pregnant.
She is.
And I can remember a few times when I was a kid, and you're about to be a father.
Where is this going?
When I was left behind.
Ah.
Which we'll use as a really cheesy segue.
Terrible
Were you
segue.
ever like lost or left as a child anywhere?
I wouldn't say I was left. I remember this was, I think, probably one of the moments that I sent the most panic into my parents' hearts and minds. On July 4th, when my sister and I decided to leave early to go to fireworks, and we took our bikes. My grandparents were over, so my parents and grandparents were getting ready to leave. And we just took off on our bikes, didn't really tell them, and rode down the road, got kind of lost in a neighborhood, ended up on someone's houseboat. This is a real story, true story.
You went from bikes to houseboat.
Yeah, we just,
okay.
I don't know how, and I don't remember tons about the night, but I do remember being on a houseboat. I was probably 9 or 10. And eventually we ended up back on our bikes, like kind of walking down the really busy road that's closest to our home. And thankfully my parents saw us and were able to pull over, and they, I think, had called the police, and they were just panicking because we were gone for hours. So, that was, I don't know if it was left behind, but we were lost. We lost ourselves.
Yeah, it was, I halfway expected you were going to go into some sort of a narrative about like Stranger Things, the new Netflix show.
It's funny.
Kids
I was actually thinking of
and,
that. Yeah. Getting lost in the woods. And
that is true.
We ended up with a little girl that has telekinesis powers.
So I've finished that series.
It's very rad.
And I know you're only a little ways in. Do you have any like snap thoughts? This will be spoiler free about Stranger Things.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, whatever my opinion means. It's been very difficult because I just finished The Wire, just finished True Detective, which in my opinion are probably two of the best series I've ever seen. So I feel like it's not fair to anything season 1 of True Detective, season 2 of True Detective was kind of but I feel like it's going to cast everything in kind of a poopy light for a while.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not that it's bad. It's not that Stranger Things is bad. It's fun. It's just that's kind of what it is to me. It's the like feel of it, but I feel like there's a very obvious intention. I just think Netflix, their approach is sort of they know exactly what people want to watch because they have all of these sort of like instruments to measure what people are interested in, and then they craft these easily marketable things to people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of going into it. I know it's not necessarily about the art of what they're doing, but a huge part of it is crafting something that is going to be palatable to people's tastes at a certain point in time.
Yeah.
So I think going into it, knowing that and just thinking like, this is fun, it's throwback to 80s. That's kind of cool. Is it like the greatest thing I've ever seen and I want to watch like the next episode right now? Not really.
It's interesting how I like hearing your perspective on it. It's interesting for me because it became like a family obsession going through the 8 episodes of this. Because again, one of those things that I love is that I get to see things through my kids' eyes to some degree.
Yeah.
And so all of this kind of stuff was really new. But yeah, so for me going through it, because we went through it in just like several days, and it was super fun just having them connected in and wanting to watch something. And for me, it's been the whole idea of kind of that scary, creepy thriller sci-fi type of a thing has been a hard thing to get them into because they'll watch about anything. But I remember like 2 instances, my oldest daughter really wanted to watch The Walking Dead, and just the menacing, creepy nature of it. We didn't get more than 15 minutes into it. Like Rick never left the hospital. But it was just like the scary lights, the sounds, and everything. And Ada's like, "I'm good. I'm out."
Yeah.
But speaking
you're definitely right. I mean, part of it is being in something with someone else, and you can both. And I think that like True Detective had a whole like Reddit following, and I think that was a big thing about it, that everyone wanted to guess what was happening next. And there were all these weird references to kind of marginal like horror writers and all these things going on that people could then talk about. So I think that's part of it. You know, to me, that's what's great about music, is being able to pull like all these references together and talk about, you know, what people were thinking or feeling kind of in the moment of making it. And yeah, that's the greatest series to me have been the ones that I've been able to watch with Kelly. Yeah. So I totally get that. And I think that might be a better segue into Left Behind, because I think that's what really pulled people together on this, is this sort of, it's like you're reading a book, but then it's connecting you with your world and with a community of people and trying to like read these signs of what's going on in your world. So you start having like political discussion. You know, I think back in the 90s, it's, you know, Saddam Hussein or whatever world leader at the time people didn't like is, you know, Nikolai Carpathia, the Antichrist. And you know, I think at one point people thought like Oprah was the Antichrist. And I mean, whatever person you don't like at the time and is scary to you is the Antichrist.
Especially when they give out free cars.
Yeah, definitely. That's a
total Antichrist move.
Exactly.
Sarcasm.
But I don't know, and just being able to like, there's this whole culture that we can get into. I would love to talk about it. I've actually studied this stuff in both in the church and in the classroom at UNC.
So let me pause real quick, because I think we out-segued ourselves.
If we segued to segue.
We did. Well, we segued so well, I think it was so seamless that no one actually completely knows at this moment what we're talking about. It was that good. It was sleight of hand. So yes, what brings us to even this topic, because like you'd even mentioned, what was it, like 80s, 90s, when like the whole Left Behind book series came out. Yeah. So we're not using that as current news. Like, hey, have you guys heard about this new book series?
Well, Nicolas Cage did make a movie like last year.
And I have not sat down and watched it yet.
Shame on you.
I know. Have you?
I watched pieces with Kelly. She got impatient waiting for me, so she watched it, and I was in and out.
I have to be in the right mood to be able to deal with like the schlock that's going to be happening, you know, on top of it with Nick Cage.
Yeah.
So like those are two things. But the reason we're even bringing this up was, and I'll go ahead and preface this. It was like, I think a week and a half ago, Tim LaHaye, who's the author of the whole series that has a huge following and everything else like that, passed away. And the purpose of us talking through this isn't, and I want to talk about like the cultural impact or the cultural damage, I think, that kind of happened because of a lot of this stuff. But this is no way that we are pissing on his grave. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Like, I want to really deconstruct more of the kind of cultural impact of things, we're not attacking the man or anything else like that. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I want that to be fair, because I think it would be in bad taste for us to just say, someone died, good riddance, and just riff on that for the whole time. Because I mean, there may be a show where we do that. I'm not ruling it out, but that's not the case here.
I mean, the legacy is huge with Left Behind, and regardless of how people feel about it, this is just an anecdotal evidence to me of how big Left Behind is. I have a friend who is an atheist, and I mean, is the furthest thing you would think from someone who is religious, but read through the whole series because he just found it interesting. And the whole, I mean, it reads like fantasy and sci-fi. And so I feel like, you know, even without that religious component, it's a compelling book. I wouldn't call it like great literature, but it's interesting to people.
So for those that may not be initiated into this, Like explain. I don't want like I don't want like a summary.
You don't want a summary of all 9 or 12 books. Or
that's not what I'm at. But give us like, I don't know, what is your like 2 or 3 sentence overview if you were to describe this to someone that did not know what these books were?
Yeah. So and we'll talk more about the kind of movement behind Left Behind. Left Behind, the true story. Basically, it's the idea that, there's a rapture, which is this a specific Christian idea within like a specific Christian tradition, that Jesus is coming and is going to pull up everyone from the earth that is a quote unquote true Christian, and take them to heaven, and then everyone else sort of suffers through all of these trials on earth, like Satan coming to earth and ruling, and the Antichrist, and there are lots of like, I don't call them miracles, like supernatural events happening, and there are prophets and dragons and
so that's, I mean, for those that don't know lots of church speak, I mean, we would use the term eschatology, which is kind of just the belief of how things are going to end. Would be, I think, the churchy word that we'd be using.
End of the world
stuff, yeah.
As REM called it.
Yeah. And on top of it, so this isn't just stuff that comes from nowhere. A lot of this has come from the book of Revelation.
Well,
the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
yeah,
that's where like the whole talks of eschatology comes from. I mean, there's book of
That's
Daniel
where the symbolism
stuff.
and stuff definitely comes from.
And it's one of those books in the Bible that I think leads to lots of speculation, lots of conversation, because I mean it's funny, like when I hear people talk about or preach about, especially referencing Revelation a lot of time, there's those kind of like how people like to henpeck through stuff, like to where this is figurative and this is literal as you're reading through this, and it just happens. People like to use that whenever it suits them when reading through Revelation, which again, there's lots of symbolism. I mean, I think there's certain things that we can gain from it, but I think there's a whole lot of mystery to it as well. And so the idea of really going through this as if we're laying this out like it's a literal timeline, well, this happens, and typically those, because in the church, historically, the belief of how things are going to happen in the end is wildly debated amongst many different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like art. I mean, it's like any type of art. There are lots of symbols, and you can read meaning into it. You can also derive meaning from potentially seeing the age in which it was created, and trying to see the problems that the author was responding to and things like that. So some people just tend to take it on face value and read into the symbols what they think it means.
Well, and I think it also just needs to be said too that the style that John, who actually wrote the book back from Bible times, I mean, he's writing kind of in a genre,
right?
An apocalyptic genre.
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes when people read it and it's smushed together, because again, I would say the Bible is kind of like a library.
Yeah.
When you look at it, not like a cohesive, and people would argue with me for saying this, but not necessarily a cohesive, like from point A to point, it was written completely, but with the same narrative voice, the same style the whole way through, which some people view the Bible that way. And so when you approach stuff like Revelation, if you're having this idea that everything is kind of like this is one large book that you've gone from the beginning to end on with the same author, the same narrative style, it can be really weird once you get to Revelation. And I think not seeing this as kind of seeing the Bible as a library of books of different people's experiences with God, throughout history, I think it tends to mess up how you read Revelation. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? If you see it as just one large work.
Yeah.
And then also, I guess what I'm really trying to get at was that John in that book is writing a specific genre or style.
Right.
And if we just assume that this is part of a larger narrative, it gets kind of weird and wonky without like commenting that he's actually writing in a specific style here. I don't know. Yeah. I took way too long to say that. Sorry.
No. It's a really good point. And I also want to point out that, there is a history to this reading of Revelation. It's something that showed up more in the kind of 19th century, like mid to end 19th century. You have people like, I know William Miller was one person that started counting the numbers in Revelation and trying to like predict the date of the end of the world. He got it wrong. He had like a huge following in his area, which is somewhere in sort of like northern United States. And then when he got it wrong, then he tried to predict it again for like a year later. He was like, oops, I missed a number. So there was this kind of culture of like counting and looking at symbols. And part of that connects into the way that kind of modern thinkers were starting to look at the world and trying to find evidence and not taking things at face value, but asking lots of questions and trying to derive like methods of being able to think, because if you have a method, then you're taking yourself out of it.
Sarcasm.
Sorry, I meant to hit the sarcasm button, but I hit the laughing, which both of them.
I know. I was like, what is going on in my ears right now?
No, so anyway, from this, you have this movement called, the really clunky term that scholars use is premillennial dispensationalism, that people created this kind of method or system of thinking of time, that there were dispensations, that you can find symbols in the Bible of figuring out these dispensations. And then from that, you can figure out when this sort of end of time is. Almost always, it's whatever time you're living in.
That's true, yeah.
So that way you can look at all the symbols and be right about what you're seeing in the world. And the premillennial part, I think, is important as well, because it's the idea that there's this millennium. There's the millennium means this 1,000-year reign of Jesus, which is also something that's pulled out of the Bible and with numbers and stuff like that. And the premillennial part is that there's something that's going to happen kind of first, which is also an apocalyptic thing, that God is somehow going to intervene in the world, and that that's the rapture part. That's the letting Satan loose on the earth and, to do all these things and all these signs happening and supernatural things. That's the pre-millennial part. And then after all that happens, then you get the millennium, which is Jesus sort of ruling or whatever. So there's actually an entire Bible written with this system in mind. So in the sort of 19th century, you have this system, and then it gets picked up by some people in like the 60s, 70s, 80s that want to sort of revive this idea that we can look at the times. And the 60s were a pretty troubling time for some people. They saw tons of change in the world. And so what do? You say, this is the end of the world. And you start seeing symbols. And so Tim LaHaye, I think, comes from this tradition. And in the article, it says, he had this idea. He was riding on a plane and was thinking, what if the rapture happened? And, what would happen to the plane and the people on it? So that's actually the beginning of the Left Behind story.
Well, really how that had happened was he was on the plane, and the in-flight movie was Con Air. And so he was able to really just kind of,
which is his connection with Nick Cage.
Absolutely. And it totally, that finally had all come together. And even like the way
Sarcasm.
Thank you. Even the way that you're describing the way like that folks are approaching this and reading it, it really makes more sense with Nick Cage. Because now I'll have to go and watch the movie today, but simply because you're almost making it sound like it's like National Treasure 3.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is that. It's pulling on this idea that there are all these hidden things and puzzles that once you figure it out, then, or the Da Vinci Code, I think, is another. National Treasure is basically the Da Vinci Code for kids. But yeah, it's this idea that we can solve puzzles, and I don't know. I was definitely drawn to this. I grew up in a tradition. Maybe we'll talk some about this as well. That idea of sort of, it's a Turner burn, but it pulls in this preaching about it being the end of the world and where do you want to be kind of at the end of the world when the rapture happens. And you go to, I would go to these conferences where they would give you workbooks and you would figure out what the symbols. They had pictures in them that were drawn by some artist of like all this stuff happening, and I don't know, it was weird. Just an example.
Do they have was there like a Rapture coloring book or something like that too?
Yeah, it literally, that's what it is.
It's
basically a Rapture coloring book.
Can you color
for
the people
teenagers
being thrown into the pit of fire?
There is, I think, a pit of fire in there. And the thing that I remember, it was something about us having like heavenly bodies, and they said that you could run from one end of the universe to the other in like a second. It's just, I mean, it's trying to explain and be literal with things that I don't think were meant for, that wasn't the intention when people wrote the whatever symbols or the metaphors. But people have picked this up, and whatever their intention, there's lots of puzzles and things that they try to solve, and they give you their explanation for it and charge you to go to a conference to learn about it. So, or publish a best-selling series.
Well, and I think too that, I mean, we're kind of deconstructing a few things within this. I mean, I think two things need to be said when we're looking at this. One, that there is a whole, strand of scholarship behind like approaching Revelation, that all those things already happened. When you read the book, that like most of those were describing stuff that was happening within Rome during the time and during the lifetime of John and everything else like that too.
Yeah,
so
that's
the
one
idea,
interpretation.
That is one, yes.
Yeah.
And also, just secondly, just to note to all of this, like you'd said this, and I just want to point it out even more, that like this obsession with end times in this. I mean, a lot of this that we're talking about is only like the past 100, 150 years. With a lot of this viewpoint of
very
it.
recent.
And I think that one thing that we forget about if we don't really look historically at how the church has walked and progressed and gone through stuff, we can just assume this is how it's always been. Like I know people that are obsessed with this kind of stuff, pastors, and they will preach this like this is part of church history. Like this is a voice, this is a kind of a strand or a narrative that has always been around. But I think it's also interesting to point out the fact that some of this way of interpreting it has only been around for a short period of time. If you're comparing it to, I guess, the entire history of the church.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that part gets lost in this too.
Yeah. And it's definitely, I think when you're preaching, the people, you're right, people do get very caught up in the sort of symbolism and the method. But I think one of the dangers is that when you are trying to identify very specific things in your world, that you're othering for one, and you're definitely, you're sort of like labeling enemies, or you're labeling bad things. And I think there are a couple of dangers there. One, sort of the obvious danger that I think more people are catching on to now, that we can't just scapegoat everyone that doesn't fit in with our worldview. But also, I think implicitly, it's dangerous to other, because then it somehow makes you okay. Like and that's definitely one of sort of the bedrock fundamental ideas in the movement, is that once you say a prayer and convert or whatever to Christianity, that you're good. That's kind of the one thing you need to do to get caught up in the rapture, and that anyone else who hasn't done that is sinful, evil, going to hell, whatever.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, a lot of this, one, you'd mentioned that the train of thought leads to scapegoating. I mean, scapegoating's been around since the beginning of humanity.
It's just a new form of scapegoating.
It is. It's kind of a Christian scapegoating, but I think also what it does is it creates this kind of bedrock of Christian escapism too.
Yeah, that's another big thing.
I mean, the idea that somehow we're going to be, again, which I would say that whole idea and that whole kind of thought stream is very Gnostic. And the idea somehow that, like, the Gnostics believing simply that the spirit is pure, and that those things that are terrestrial or flesh or of our world are bad. And so the only way that we can somehow get to the pure place is to leave it. That God will come and rescue us out of this horrible place that we live in that is just covered in sin and everything else.
And then blow it up.
Yeah, blow it up.
And then
which also completely negates, the first book of the Bible where God creates everything and says that it's good.
Right.
So it kind of, I think that folks like to hold the idea that God created stuff and that's good in one hand, and that God's going to burn it all up and get us out of here in the other hand, but never fold your hands together with those two pieces of how they think about it. As long as we keep these apart, our ideology makes sense.
And I've never thought about the irony that, that, because you're totally, I'd agree with you on that. When going to some of these conferences growing up, there is this idea that, why take care of the earth? It's going to go away. I remember explicitly thinking that growing up, that God's going to destroy the world, so why do anything to take care of the world? And ironically, it might be people with that attitude that actually end up burning up the world.
Wait, what?
Yeah. It's not God. It's the Christians that are, foolishly think that the world is just going to be blown up anyway.
Well, you're right. If you feel like we're on a sinking ship and none of this matters and that God's going to rescue us, the idea of caring for the environment really doesn't matter.
Right.
The idea of living in the long term, how do we make this world better to leave it to our children, really goes out the window.
Right.
And one thing I think has been funny, and the nearing 4 decades of me being on this earth, I feel like at every age I've been at, there's always somebody saying, you're mentioning looking for the signs of end times and all that kind of stuff. There's always been folks that have been oh man, the end is near. Jesus is coming back soon.
Yeah.
And then it's but it's funny because you hear this over and over again, much like you said, the guy that was trying to predict the dates, the exact dates to the end of the world.
Yeah.
But it's like that. It's, again, I think what you were saying is it's scapegoating. We end up doing this the whole thing, and yeah, it's, we're in the end times. Oh, it's going to happen. Oh, it's going to happen soon. And but this is just this thing that rings true over and over and over again that I hear consistently with people, even though the world doesn't end and things keep moving on. And,
right.
I think that, and I think it's one of the damaging things that has happened within. Well, I think that it's not simply just this book series has spawned it. I think this book series threw a lot of fuel onto the fire to keep it going. These kind of false narratives where it's really just, about us not being engaged, in the things that are going on, not engaged with the suffering, not engaged with the atrocities we're doing to the environment. And it gives us an excuse to just be able to step back and disengage and just not care about it.
Right. And someone mentioned that this book series is probably one of the, I think they said, I guess Falwell said that this book series was the most influential book series on Christians, books on Christians outside of the Bible. And at first I wanted to resist that.
That sounds like Trump almost.
Yeah, I know. But honestly, if you think kind of on a great grand scale, they have sold millions and millions of copies. They have had an influence on the way that people see the world, and there are movie series that are spawned by them. I don't want to say that the ideas are, really important and have changed the course of Christian history, but these books are extremely influential on the way that people see the world. I just would say I don't know if it's in a good way.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's, and that's one thing that we do here on the show. One of the reasons we have this show is simply that you have these two guys that are, we're both ex-pastors, and that are kind of sick of the way that American Christianity has gone, and really feeling like it's been moved off path. And stuff like this, I really do think, you'll have it, like you'd mentioned, like Falwell said, it's so influential. Just because it's been influential doesn't mean it's been a good thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I can think of that series, stuff like Purpose-Driven Life and all this other kind of stuff, too.
Yeah.
It's,
I was trying to think of some of the, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I feel like is probably one of the big ones.
Yeah, but I mean, influential wise.
Prayer of Jabez was a big one for a while. Yeah.
I mean, but these kind of things. But I think ultimately what they do is they end up being very. And I'm not talking about like C.S. Lewis's stuff. I'm talking about the other stuff we were mentioning. They end up being very easy and palatable for the masses, and most of the time ends up making us feel good or engaging us in a way that still doesn't challenge us. You know, when they're again, you were talking about how it's these things have been influential, like second to the Bible type of thing. Not your quote, but you're quoting someone else. And within that, I mean, I think that when you read the Bible, it should challenge you. And I don't think these works really challenge people, which also is why I think that they become very popular. You know what I mean? I'm doing my spiritual thing, and it's easy, you know, like purpose-driven life. Oh, I can do this and feel good about myself type of stuff. You know, I mean, it ends up being kind of very like, oh, like, yeah.
It just sort of, it feeds where you're already at.
Yeah.
And it like facilitates, where you're already at, which is, I mean, it's the evangelical church in the last 50 to 60 years. I mean, that's been the thrust, in my opinion, has been how do we make this as easy on people as possible to get people in, because it's driven by this idea that we need to reach as many people as possible. And I mean, honestly, this might be a little bit of a tangent, but I think it also goes hand in hand with capitalism. It's sort of like, let's get down to some things like as base value as possible. Let's maximize the numbers. Let's maximize the profit. You know, I wouldn't say that pastors just explicitly say that or think that. There are churches that are built on business models. I mean, a lot of churches now are built on business models, especially evangelical churches.
I was laughing at your use of the word "some."
Yeah, many churches, but you know, sort of at its base, it makes sense because we live in the United States. We just assume that capitalism, you know, those sort of capitalistic principles that everyone's out for themselves, that, you know, if we do sort of pursue self-interest, that it will benefit everyone or more people at once, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it makes sense that you would try to do something that's more marketable, that you would open it up to more people. With Left Behind, I think what's interesting, it also goes kind of hand in hand with the evangelical idea that you need to sort of make things as simple as possible. Tim LaHaye actually wrote a book on his like method of reading Revelation and reading this sort of stuff, and it's really strange. It's sort of be literal as much as possible. So read things literally as much as possible. So if it says there's a dragon, you don't try to, you know, coming out of the ocean, which is one of the things in Revelation, unless you can find some reason that a dragon wouldn't come out of the ocean, you know, and you don't see something in that contradicts. It's really strange. Like, I mean, contradicts the world around you.
It happened in Pacific Rim.
That's true.
So that could.
So we need to make giant Christianity robots. That
sarcasm.
So I don't know.
Sorry, I totally threw off your train of thought.
No, that's fine. So just this idea that you want to take things as simply as possible to reach as many people as possible, which was also sort of an evangelical thing. Has its roots in like the market preaching, you know, of early evangelical Christianity in the United States, to go out and to put things in plain terms for people. I don't want to call it dumbing down because I think there is some benefit in that, but it's the intention behind it. It's let's get this out to as many people as possible. So let's like take things that are tough and let's just assume that, you know, everyone's going to understand them right off the bat.
Well, and with that, I liked how you were tying this in with capitalism, because when you think about this, and when you have folks like Falwell and some other article I was reading about I think it was like Christianity Today was really saying, oh, one of the most influential. But I think that we say things are influential simply based upon how many copies were sold.
Numbers, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but we do that. Like, oh, these were all these best-selling series, and we're using influence, and we're also using sales in order to be able to quantify that, which really tells me, I mean, how many people's lives were changed by this, all this other kind of stuff. No. We want to know the sales of it because that is successful.
Versus something like Karl Barth's Dogmatics of Christianity, which I've read maybe like 5 pages of it. I mean, there are thousands of pages of this document or of this book, these books, but they're super influential because scholars find the ideas intriguing. They might not sell millions of copies, but it's very influential. So that kind of being another contrast to what you were saying.
Well, it is, because I think that the way that we're even quantifying, which is a whole nother probably show we could do, how we quantify, in the American system of doing this, and in the Church of America system that we do this, how we quantify what is influential. Mm-hmm. I like how you're talking about these other works that end up being very seminal and what I would call more influential, but they're harder reads. Mm-hmm. Not simply because of the language they use or the scholarship that they go behind it, but I think that the thoughts are challenging. Mm-hmm. The thoughts move us. I mean, because there's certain stuff that, C.S. Lewis at times is hard to get through because it's dense, and the ideas that he's unpacking are hard with that. And I think that, we like to say things, because most of these works we're talking about, and they're folks that we rip on. I mean, you can say think of like the best-selling Christian authors like the Osteens, or like the Rick Warrens, all of these are very much like what you'd say like pillow fight type stuff. You know what I mean? It's like a Christian pillow fight that's happening. But when you talk about reading stuff like Lewis or like Barth or all these other folks that I would say have deeper truths to them, is kind of like the folks that you're bringing a knife to a pillow fight.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a difference, and and it isn't going to reach as many people. But when we look at this in the Bible, there's times where he says, Jesus preached a hard lesson and the crowd thinned. Mm-hmm. That some of these things aren't meant to be easy. They're not meant to be palatable. They're not meant to be bestsellers. They're not meant to, be something that just everybody, oh, sure, I can do this. I mean, you'd mentioned this before too, this obsession with how a lot of this LaHaye stuff fit in with this whole obsession with evangelism. Mm-hmm. Meaning getting as many people saved as quickly as possible. But when you do that, it ends up being, and I think some of this stuff has spawned this, which I do need to note, one of the other things without the Left Behind series, one thing that it did give us was Christian Kirk Cameron.
Kirk Cameron.
Yeah. I mean, because again, I think that launched his career in a totally different direction.
Oh, yeah.
Being able to star in that and other things of that nature. So thanks, Tim LaHaye.
That was like his coming out party as a Christian.
Yes. Just the idea of coming out part. Yeah, never mind.
Yeah.
But really how it changed how, one, you're right. I think it turned our faith into a sales pitch. Mm-hmm. And when you're trying to, I guess, put together a sales pitch, like you mentioned before, man, that we want to make this as simple as possible, as dumbed down as possible. And I think in the end, requiring as little as possible of you in order to step in this. But I think that when we see the way that Jesus offered this to folks, he would give the hard teaching, he would give an invitation, but the invitation came at a cost. Mm-hmm. It wasn't simply that whole idea of, Jesus is my own personal savior.
Yeah, and I think it connects into with this idea that the kind of Protestant in general idea that knowledge is available to everyone. That post Protestant Reformation, you get sort of everyone publishing the Bible in local languages and vernacular, not in Latin anymore. You don't want Catholic priests like mediating the meaning of scriptures and stuff like that. And I think there is kind of an important idea in that. I am a Protestant. I have very strong Catholic leanings, but I can understand that, but kind of on the flip side of that, the idea that just anyone can read something and glean important meaning. I think it takes the work out of it. It takes the humility out of approaching a text, and it takes the thought out of it, honestly. So there's some sort of middle ground, or there's another way of being able to wrestle with something, of not having an immediate meaning, especially with Scripture, and I think texts that are much deeper than something like Left Behind. Being able to sort of wrestle with it over a long period of time in community with other people. And you can definitely have a voice in that. And I think the more voices that can contribute, the better, which is maybe more of a Protestant thought. I don't know. Catholics would maybe argue with me on that because there are a lot of voices in the Catholic Church as well now. But sort of on the flip side, I think there is a value in someone having dedicated their lives to understanding the meaning of something and being able to kind of glean from their perspective or their wisdom, which is that's kind of contrary to the modernist thinking that everyone should be able to stand on their own 2 feet, think for themselves, apply some sort of method to take themselves out of what they're thinking, not relying on the tradition that has come before them anymore, but being able to think for themselves. I think there's another way between those two things, or apart from those two things, where you can gain from the strengths of both.
Well, and I liked how you were laying that out. And when we begin to think about how capitalism has influenced the church in many ways, I think that when you begin to look at books like this, when you begin to kind of run in circles that think like this, I think that what we've begun to see more and more, and that middle ground that you were kind of trying to talk about is the fact that at most churches on a Sunday morning, the pastor's job is to tell you how to think. Mm-hmm. Is somehow that what it's become is you take scripture, and since you've been to seminary and you know all this, and you simply kind of chew it up, and you
can use a Greek dictionary.
Yes, it makes you sound smarter.
One of my pet peeves.
No, but it ends up being kind of like what you see like mama birds do. They kind of chew up the food enough, and then they spit it in their baby's mouth, so the baby doesn't have to actually chew it on their own. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what begins to happen, and we see this in congregations where we're not necessarily equipping people to think on their own, to read it on their own, because what we see walked out by the leaders is simply just, we will go ahead and pre-digest this food for you so you don't have to think and you can know what to think. Mm-hmm. Because that's a control structure, mm-hmm. is how you set that up. And I think it feels dangerous to give people tools and then allow them to walk it out and figure out what it means in their own context, in their own lives, and in their own journey. And so I think that ends up being a harder road to take. And I think that this way that we've seen Christianity kind of move, where we have brought it to a place where it's this, all you need to know is X, Y, and Z, pray a prayer, and walk it out, and you're good. And then just go to church, mm-hmm. On top of it. I don't think that we're actually really creating people that are wrestling it out, people that are feeling what is the cost of following after Christ. What does it mean, to embrace these things in the world that we live in today?
Or the experience of getting to reach one of those sort of aha moments. Mm-hmm. There's a real joy in that. And I think it's exciting when someone else can do that on their own. And that, I think more of that is reading along with people rather than, like you said, sort of standing up in front of people and saying, okay, this is the text we're going to read for today. This is what it means. So when people go back to that text, they'll feel equipped in the sense that someone has already told them what it means.
Yeah.
Versus, this is something that, I experienced or I see going on, and I feel like the text can speak to this in this way. And then people being able to maybe pull from that, well, I see this going on, and I feel like the text is addressing this in this way. And it being more of kind of a conversation. But there is, I don't know, that's one of the things that has been seminal to me in my faith in the years is to figure out what the word know means. Like the scripture talks about knowing God or knowing Jesus. Paul talked about the sort of overwhelming joy of knowing Christ, knowing Christ's love. Is that word know, it is not what we would think of as knowledge, which is what you were describing. I think a lot of people would think of know as sort of memorization of facts, mm-hmm. or being able to have a ready answer. It's not an experiential knowledge, but the word know in the scriptures, that's what it's talking about. It's the way that people know each other when they're married or when they're in a relationship. It's a very experiential thing that happens over a long period of time with commitment from both sides. And I don't know, you're not, especially if you are sort of ready-made handing over this like definition of no to people, then you're blocking out anything that reaches beyond that, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, that's why I think that in many ways you hear people describe faith as a journey. And, you know, there's a difference between me going on a trip and taking pictures, because each of those pictures is a remembrance of where I was, what was happening, what it smelled like, what we were doing, you know, those kind of things. And, you know, for me to sit down and be able to say, hey, look at this picture. I'm going to tell you about what happened in it. And I can give you information and knowledge, but you're not going to know what it was like to be there in that moment.
Right, exactly.
And I think that happens from the pulpits too often, is that there's been somebody that has wrestled through this. There's been somebody that has journeyed to get, like you're saying, the knowledge and the wisdom behind this. But a lot of those things with wisdom and knowledge, it has to be earned. You know, it has to be stumbled through the good times and the bad times. You know, perspective happens that way. And when we steal those opportunities and we create a culture within the church that they just need to be able to listen to other people that have experienced this, it's not the same as them experiencing it themselves. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like we're arming people with facts.
Right.
We're not actually equipping people to go out and experience God in their own realm.
Yeah. And those facts are, I would put quotes around the facts too, because
that's true. It's subjective, yeah.
Yeah, not quite understandable what the facts mean. And I think it's really dangerous too, because those things change over time. And, you know, people 10 years down the road are still like holding on to the same meaning of something when they see the world in a different way. It's very difficult to, you know, I mean, then you just begin sort of manufacturing these adaptations so that you can accommodate what people handed on to you as facts, you know, because facts are things that are not supposed to change. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we change, you know, the world changes, and it's not quite as useful of a thing, you know, if you're looking kind of 5-10 years down the road.
Well, and it's something that I've heard over and over again, especially we begin to talk about the religious right. We begin to talk about even just politics in general. You know, one thing that gets thrown around is the idea that you can possess truth. Mm-hmm. You know, meaning that like one side will say, "Oh, well, we have the truth," and the truth, you know, you can't argue this, and this is what it is, as if it's a stagnant thing that stands there, and that somehow that I understand all of it, mm-hmm. and you understand none of it, and I think some of it is. Again, I mean, we've kind of gotten to this place in culture and history, especially in America, where we are so polarized. And the idea that somehow, without conversation in the middle, that somebody that is relegated way to this side on the right or way to this side on the left, and that has like built fences and walls to keep others out, that somehow that you can solely possess that truth, if that makes sense. I mean, some of it, like, again, we're talking about wisdom and knowledge, needs to be wrestled out. It needs to be challenged. It needs to be experienced. And things change, like you'd said, like over time in life. I mean, certain bits of wisdom speak deeper to me because I've been through things. I've been there. It's in different situations.
And left behind as a sort of a cultural document, I think it proves that point that, you know, whereas people in the past have said, you know, the world is ending on this day, and that was proven wrong. When you sort of lay these things out as these like literal facts, you know, you can see how Left Behind was responding to its milieu, its world, and now the world is very different. Mm-hmm. I mean, somewhat the same, but and I think that's the danger of kind of laying out. You know, this is the way that you should read this. Mm-hmm. That 20 years down the road, more than likely, you're going to be proven wrong. Yeah, it's just going to look wrong. So I don't know. That's why I think it's really important to sort of draw people into a wrestling and a living out and an experiencing of that process of being able to figure out, you know, what is this trying to say to us now, and what are we supposed to do about it? rather than necessarily laying out some sort of system that people are going to be able to, pick up a book and read accessibly on an airplane when they're hoping not to get sucked out of the window.
Yeah,
as long
as Nick Cage is flying it.
Yeah. They have little Rapture parachutes under the seats.
That's
in case of Rapture.
That's right. But what you're also mentioning here is hitting on something deeper that, and I think that's we've seen culture move there, but we've also seen the church move there. When we make things about our own personal knowledge, our own personal relationship, our own personal stuff, wrestling doesn't really happen on your own. Mm-hmm. I mean, unless you're like, what is it, at the beginning of Fight Club? When Ed Norton goes to his boss and beats himself up. Yeah.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah. I wasn't going to that spoiler. I was just going, there's a scene where his boss, Ed Norton's challenging his boss, mm-hmm. and begins to, essentially, he gets into a fight with himself in order to make it look like the boss beat him up. Yeah. Type of a situation. So that's not really like the kind of wrestling that we're talking about within here. But I think that one of the important things is I think the Bible speaks differently in community with people. Mm-hmm. Like when it's wrestled in community, not simply just saying, I already know this, I have this, it's just a bunch of facts and figures in my head and I can move on my way. Mm-hmm. And I think the further cultures move towards like individualism and how we identify in that way, I think we've lost this deeper wrestling in community with folks. And I think, and even furthermore, I really don't think we look at community in the way that we should. Mm-hmm. I think that like geographically, I feel like that we don't pay attention to our communities in that context, but also I think we don't cultivate community as in having folks that you can do life with, that you can wrestle through Scripture with appropriately.
So you're saying we're just Snapchatting our faith?
Oh, like it. Yes. And so last as we're like in the final minute or so of the show, one thing I do want to ask, Ben, and this may be homework for you, that you will need to report back if you have not already done this.
Book report.
No, this is the kind of homework you'd like. Have you ever played Left Behind Tribulation Force?
No, I have not.
That is a video game.
Is there a Bible gun involved?
Well, I do remember this. This is a few years back this came out. So again, when we're talking about this thing, were we writing these books strictly to be able to reach people, or is this a whole marketing way to make money? I'll leave that up to you, dear viewers. But there is a game, and I'm pretty sure you can find it. It's called Left Behind Tribulation Force. And what I do remember of it was that folks kind of got mad about this a few years ago when it came out, because you could pick to be a man or a woman, in this. But if you were a female character, the only job you could have is being a helper to the men.
Wow.
To the men in it. Whereas if you're a male character, you could have all these different kind of jobs and things to do. You weren't just a helper mate type of thing like that. So Ben, you have homework to be able to find this game. Please don't pay for it because
I might just YouTube a video of someone playing it.
Okay. That may be less time for you to invest in. But as we begin to round this up, we started talking about Tim LaHaye, and I think it also just begs to be saying, this may come to the part where I was saying something I didn't want to do earlier about pissing on someone's grave. But some of Tim LaHaye's legacies. We had already mentioned Kirk Cameron, like being here. I mean,
they were like besties.
He didn't father him, but I think he gave his career a second wind. But a few other things that we can say. He was very influential in the idea of conversion therapy.
Was he really?
Yeah, he wrote books and other stuff about that. I'm not saying he was the guy who started it, but I think perpetuating it and bringing it to a larger audience and a larger way of thinking, if that makes sense.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
goodness gracious.
Yeah, so conversion therapy, which I've heard is fun. It's just like camp.
Sarcasm.
With water.
Yeah, what kind of camp?
With waterboarding.
Concentration camp?
Guantanamo
Bay camp?
Yeah, it could be. So that kind of stuff. But also, here's one thing that I do need to note, and this was in his obituary. It said also in the 70s, LaHaye encouraged the late Jerry Falwell Sr. to establish the moral majority as a way to build support and like a coalition like nationally. So again, when we've ripped on the religious right and the moral majority, he was the guy that like whispered in Falwell's ear, and apparently Falwell's like, that sounds like a good idea. I don't know.
I'm going to start a university.
Oh, but sadly we have run out of time, and apparently I've run out of urine from peeing on graves. I'll have to go get more coffee for us to continue this later. But I'll go ahead. So just a reminder that as we end this broadcast, that you can catch us on podcast at www.snarkyfaith.com. You can catch all of our old shows. Go on Facebook and Twitter, look up Snarky Faith. We're there. Like us. If you feel charitable, also hop over on iTunes. Give us 5-star ratings here. I like 5 better than 4. And we love hearing from you. You can write us at questions@snarkyfaith.com. And that is all we got this week. We are out of here.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Aqueduct Conference Centre was established in 1978 as a peaceful destination for small group meetings, special events, conferences, retreats, and weddings. For more information, go to www.aqueductcc.com. We are also sponsored by Lumen. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be better than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.